Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The drive up to Mirror Lake that Saturday morning felt different somehow, like the forest was holding its breath. At 29, I'd been doing nature photography professionally for about 6 years, and I'd hiked that particular trail maybe 40 times before. The parking area at the trailhead was almost empty when I arrived around 7 in the morning, just 2 other cars there, which was perfect for what I needed. I wanted to catch the early morning mist rolling off the lake surface, that golden hour light that makes everything look like a painting. My backpack was loaded with my usual gear, my Canon with 3 different lenses, the carbon fiber tripod that cost me a month's rent, protein bars, 2 water bottles, and my emergency whistle that my sister Nancy made me promise to always carry after she watched some documentary about missing hikers. The first mile of the trail was exactly how I remembered it from previous trips. Pine needles crunching under my boots, birds calling out their morning songs, that fresh mountain air filling my lungs. But around the 2nd mile marker, where the path curves near that old fallen oak tree, I noticed something strange. There were these marks on several trees, about 8 feet up from the ground, like something had been scraping the bark off in long, deliberate strips. Not random like a bear would do when marking territory, but almost methodical, forming these weird patterns that reminded me of some kind of script or symbols. The exposed wood underneath was still wet with sap, meaning whatever made these marks had done it recently, maybe within the last day or 2. I took a few shots of them, thinking it might be some interesting natural phenomenon I could research later, but when I checked the photos on my camera's LCD screen, they all came out strangely overexposed in just those specific areas where the marks were, even though my settings were perfect for the lighting conditions. About 30 minutes later, I reached the spot where the trail opens up, and you get your first view of Mirror Lake. The water was perfectly still, like glass reflecting the mountains and sky so clearly, you could barely tell where the real world ended and the reflection began. But there was no mist. In all my years photographing this lake, there had always been morning mist in weather conditions like these, with the cool night air meeting the warmer water. The absence of it felt wrong, like seeing a person without their shadow. I set up my tripod anyway near my favorite spot, this little rocky outcrop that juts out about 10 feet into the water, and started taking some long exposure shots. Through my viewfinder, I kept noticing this dark shape in the tree line on the opposite shore, maybe 300 yards away. It looked like a person standing perfectly still, but when I'd lower the camera to look with my naked eyes, I couldn't make out anything unusual in those trees. The temperature dropped suddenly while I was switching lenses. I mean, dropped hard, like going from a mild spring morning to late fall in the span of maybe 2 minutes. My breath started coming out in these thick clouds, and frost actually began forming on the metal parts of my tripod. This was mid-May in California, and the weather forecast had said it would be in the 60s all day. I pulled out my phone to check the weather app, but I had no signal, which was weird because I usually get at least 1 or 2 bars up at the lake. The screen kept flickering too, showing these strange horizontal lines like an old TV with bad reception, even though I'd just charged it fully that morning. That's when I heard it, this low humming sound coming from somewhere across the lake, not mechanical like a drone or an engine, but organic somehow, almost like throat singing but deeper. So deep I could feel it vibrating in my chest cavity. I decided to pack up and head back to the car, every instinct in my body suddenly screaming at me to leave this place. But when I tried to collapse my tripod, the legs wouldn't budge, like they'd been welded in position. The metal was so cold it actually hurt to touch, even through my gloves, and I could see my skin starting to stick to it like when you touch frozen metal in winter. I had to leave it there, just grabbed my camera and started walking quickly back toward the trail. The humming sound was getting louder, or maybe closer, and now it had this weird rhythm to it, almost like words but in no language I'd ever heard. The path I'd taken to get to the lake, the same path I'd walked dozens of times, looked completely different now. The trees seemed taller, closer together, and those strange marks I'd seen earlier were on almost every trunk now, glowing faintly with this pale blue phosphorescence that pulsed in sync with that horrible humming. Then I saw movement in my peripheral vision, something massive shifting between the trees to my left, keeping pace with me but staying just far enough back that I couldn't get a clear look at it. Every time I turned my head to look directly at it, there would be nothing there, just trees and shadows. But the second I'd look away, that movement would start again. It was like whatever this thing was knew exactly where my blind spots were and stayed perfectly within them. The trail split ahead of me at a fork I didn't remember, one path leading up toward what looked like a ridge, the other descending into a ravine filled with this thick yellow fog that definitely hadn't been there on my way in. Neither path looked familiar, and my phone's GPS was just showing my location as a spinning circle in the middle of a blank gray screen. I could hear branches breaking behind me now, heavy footsteps that didn't match any animal gait I knew, more like something dragging itself forward in lurching, uneven movements. I chose the path toward the ridge, running now, my camera bag slamming against my hip with each step, the weight of it throwing off my balance on the uneven ground. Behind me, that dragging sound was getting faster, and the humming had changed into something else, like multiple voices all trying to speak at once, but none of them quite human. The trees on either side of the path were wrong too. Their bark had these wet, dark patches that looked like they were bleeding this thick black substance that smelled like copper and rotting vegetation. Some of the trees had grown together at the top, forming these unnatural arches over the trail that I had to duck under, and each time I passed through one, I could swear I felt something brush against the back of my neck, like fingers but too long, too cold. My lungs were burning from the thin air and the running, but I couldn't stop, especially when I realized the path behind me was changing, literally reshaping itself, the ground rippling like water and sealing over where my footprints had been just seconds before. The ridge path suddenly ended at a sheer drop I nearly ran straight off, my boots skidding on loose gravel as I windmilled my arms to keep from falling into what looked like a 100-foot vertical cliff that absolutely should not exist on this trail. There was no way around it. The trees pressed in tight on both sides, their branches interwoven like a wall, and some of them had those glowing marks now forming complete circles that hurt to look at directly. I could hear that thing getting closer, the dragging sound maybe 30 feet behind me now, and this smell hit me, like ozone and spoiled meat and something chemical I couldn't identify. I turned around finally, had to see what was following me, and through my camera that I raised instinctively I saw it. The thing was impossibly tall, maybe 12 feet but wrong in every proportion, like someone had stretched a person vertically but not horizontally, its arms hanging down past where knees should be, its head tilted at an angle that no neck should be able to support, and where its face should be was just this smooth pale surface with one vertical slit that kept opening and closing like it was tasting the air. My finger pressed the shutter button without me even thinking about it, pure muscle memory from years of photography, and the camera flash went off even though I had it disabled. The creature recoiled from the light, making this sound like steam escaping from a broken pipe mixed with what I can only describe as backward screaming, if that makes any sense. The flash had done something to it, or maybe just surprised it, because for a few seconds it stood completely still, and in that moment I noticed other shapes moving in the trees behind it. More of these things, all different heights and proportions, but all wrong in that same fundamental way. The cliff edge was right behind me, maybe 2 feet, and I could feel loose rocks tumbling down into the darkness below. The main creature started moving again, not walking but sort of gliding forward, while its legs made walking motions that didn't match its speed, like a video where the animation is off. I kept taking pictures, the flash going off over and over, my camera making this high-pitched whining sound I'd never heard it make before, the battery indicator dropping from full to half to critical in maybe 10 seconds. Then something grabbed my ankle from below the cliff edge, Not a hand, but something that wrapped around it like a rope made of ice-cold muscle. And I fell hard onto my stomach, my camera flying from my hands and landing near the edge. I could see now that the cliff wasn't empty space but filled with this writhing mass of something organic, like enormous pale worms or tentacles all twisted together, reaching up toward me. The tall creature was almost on top of me now, bending down in a way that made my eyes water, trying to process the impossible angles of its joints, reaching those two long arms toward my face. In desperation, I grabbed my camera and held down the shutter button, the flash strobing like a machine gun, and every burst of light revealed more of those things surrounding us, dozens of them, all swaying in unison to that humming sound that was so loud now it made my teeth ache. The camera grew hot in my hands, actually burning my palms, smoke starting to rise from the battery compartment. But I couldn't stop, wouldn't stop, because the light was the only thing keeping them from touching me. The camera battery exploded with a sharp crack and a burst of white sparks, the heat searing my hands so badly I screamed and threw it away from me. It landed somewhere in the darkness, still sparking and making these electric popping sounds, and without the flash, everything went dark for a moment before my eyes adjusted. But the creatures, all of them, had stopped moving completely, frozen in place like someone had hit pause on a video. The humming cut off instantly, leaving this deafening silence that was somehow worse than the noise. Even that thing wrapped around my ankle had gone rigid, still holding on but not pulling anymore. I stayed perfectly still, not even breathing, terrified that any movement would start everything up again. Then I heard it, coming from somewhere far below in the ravine, my camera's auto timer beeping, that familiar 3-beep pattern before it takes a photo. Beep, 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 flash. The light erupted from below, and in that split second of illumination, I saw all those creatures turn their heads, or what passed for heads, down toward the light source, and they moved toward it like moths to a flame. That 12-foot thing included, all of them flowing down the cliff face in that horrible, boneless way. My ankle was free suddenly, and I scrambled backward, away from the edge, my burnt hands screaming in pain as I used them to push myself up. The path behind me was clear now, completely normal looking, like none of what I'd just experienced had happened. Even those glowing marks on the trees were gone, and the temperature had returned to normal. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, following the trail that now looked exactly as it should. Familiar landmarks appearing where they should be, the fork in the path gone like it never existed. I could hear my camera still going off down in the ravine, the flash firing over and over, and each time it did, that humming would start for just a second before cutting off again. The parking lot appeared through the trees, my car sitting right where I'd left it, and I've never felt such relief as when I got inside and locked the doors. I drove out of there without looking back, my hands wrapped in torn pieces of my shirt, and I didn't stop driving until I hit the first gas station an hour away where I could call my sister and tell her I was coming home early, that I'd had an accident with my equipment and burned my hands. The burns healed after a few weeks, leaving these strange scars on my palms that look almost like those marks I saw on the trees, faint lines that form patterns I try not to think about too much. I never reported the camera or tripod as lost, just bought new ones and tried to move on with my life. But yesterday, a park ranger called me saying they'd found my equipment near Mirror Lake during a routine trail inspection. The tripod was still standing exactly where I'd left it, he said, and my camera was sitting on a rock nearby, completely intact, battery full, memory card empty except for one photo. He emailed it to me while we were on the phone, and when I opened it, my whole body went cold. It was a photo of me, taken from behind, walking away from the lake on that Saturday morning, but in the background, standing in the tree line, were dozens of those tall figures, all facing the camera, all perfectly in focus this time. The timestamp on the photo was from 3 hours after I'd made it back to my car, 3 hours after I'd already driven away. The ranger asked if I wanted to come pick up my gear, said it was in perfect condition, even had all my photos from that morning still on the memory card. everything except the ones I remembered taking of those creatures. I told him to keep it, to throw it away, to burn it if he wanted, and then I hung up and deleted his email, deleted the photo, tried to pretend I'd never seen it. The Hoh rainforest changed everything for me that October, and even now, sitting in my apartment in Seattle with every door locked, I keep checking the windows whenever I hear the slightest noise outside. I'd been working as a wilderness guide for about 4 years at that point, 31 years old, and pretty confident in my abilities to handle whatever the Pacific Northwest threw at me. The Olympic National Park was basically my second home, and I'd led dozens of groups through those ancient forests without any real incidents beyond the occasional twisted ankle or mild hypothermia case. But that particular week, I wasn't guiding anyone, just doing a routine trail assessment after the heavy rains we'd been having, making sure the paths were still safe for the upcoming tourist groups. The Park Service had asked me to check on some of the more remote camping areas, especially after a few hikers had reported feeling uneasy in certain spots, though nobody could really explain why. I remember pulling into the visitor center parking lot around dawn that Monday, the whole place shrouded in that thick coastal fog that makes everything look like a watercolor painting. My plan was simple enough: hike the 18-mile loop over 2 days, check the designated camping spots, clear any fallen trees from the trail, and document any damage from the storms. I'd done this exact route maybe 15 times before, knew every moss-covered log and every creek crossing by heart. But when I signed in at the ranger station, the volunteer there, an older guy named Harold who'd been working there forever, mentioned something that made me pause. He said they'd had 3 separate reports in the past month of hikers, hearing what sounded like multiple people talking in the deep forest, always just out of sight, always moving parallel to the trail. The weird part was that when these hikers would call out or try to approach the voices, they'd suddenly stop, like someone had hit a switch. Harold laughed it off, said it was probably just the echo effects you get in dense forest, but I noticed he wasn't quite meeting my eyes when he said it. The first few hours on the trail were exactly what you'd expect. Peaceful, almost meditative, with nothing but the sound of my boots squelching through the mud and the constant drip of water from the canopy above. The Hoh is one of the few temperate rainforests in the continental United States, and being inside it feels like walking through a living cathedral, with those massive Sitka spruces and western hemlocks towering 200 feet overhead. Everything is covered in this thick green moss that muffles sound and makes the whole place feel ancient and untouched. Around mile 6, I stopped at one of the backcountry sites to check the bear boxes and make sure the creek hadn't flooded the area. That's when I found the first weird thing: a brand new camping tent, one of those expensive ultralight models, set up perfectly in the designated spot but completely abandoned. The rainfly was still taut, stakes driven in at the right angles, but when I called out and then carefully unzipped the door, there was nobody inside. Just a sleeping bag laid out neatly and a backpack propped against the tent wall. The backpack had a permit tag with the name Lena McCarthy and a date from 4 days earlier, which immediately set off alarm bells in my head, because nobody leaves their gear like that in the backcountry unless something's seriously wrong. I pulled out my radio to call it in, but all I got was static, which isn't unusual in the valleys but still made me uneasy given the circumstances. Inside the pack, everything was organized perfectly. Food sorted in stuff sacks, clothes rolled military style, first aid kit easily accessible in the top pocket. Her phone was in there too, dead battery, along with a journal where the last entry, dated 3 days ago, just said hearing them again. Closer now, maybe 20 yards parallel to my tent, at least 3 distinct voices but can't make out words, going to investigate in the morning. The handwriting got progressively shakier toward the end of the sentence, like she was writing in the dark, or maybe just scared. What really got to me though was her camping stove, still set up on a flat rock nearby with a pot of what had been instant coffee, now diluted by 3 days of rain, like she'd been in the middle of making breakfast when she just walked away. I started searching the immediate area in expanding circles, calling out Lena's name every few seconds, but the forest just swallowed my voice like it was nothing. About 15 feet from the tent, I found what made my chest tighten with genuine fear. These deep parallel grooves in the moss, maybe 3 feet apart, like something heavy had been dragged through. The moss in the hoe grows so thick that it takes real force to tear through it like that. And these marks were deep, exposing the dark soil underneath. They led away from the campsite, heading northwest, deeper into the forest where the trail doesn't go, where the trees grow so close together that even at noon it's perpetually twilight. I followed them for maybe 20 feet before they just ended, not gradually fading but stopping abruptly at the base of a massive cedar tree, as if whatever made them had simply ceased to exist at that spot. The ground beyond was completely undisturbed, that pristine green carpet of moss without a single footprint or broken twig. I stood there for a good 5 minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, when I heard it. Voices, multiple people talking in conversational tones coming from somewhere off to my left, but impossible to pinpoint exactly. The acoustic properties of the rainforest are strange, with all that moss absorbing and redirecting sound. But this was different from any echo or trick of the forest I'd experienced before. The voices seemed to move, sliding between the trees like smoke, sometimes sounding 50 feet away. Then suddenly much closer, maybe 10 feet, but I never saw anyone. The really unsettling part was that I could almost understand them, like when you hear people talking in the next room, and you can make out the rhythm and cadence of conversation, but not the actual words. I called out several times, identified myself as a wilderness guide, asked if anyone needed help, but the moment my voice left my mouth, the other voices stopped completely, leaving just the steady drip of water from the branches. The silence that followed was worse than the voices, that complete absence of sound that shouldn't exist in a forest full of life, and I realized I hadn't heard a single bird or squirrel since I'd found Lena's tent. I backed away slowly toward the campsite, keeping my eyes on the trees where I'd heard the voices, and that's when I noticed something that made my mouth go dry. Fresh footprints in the mud near the edge of the clearing. Lots of them, way more than could be explained by one lost hiker. They overlapped each other in chaotic patterns, some barefoot, others in what looked like boots, all different sizes, circling the campsite like whoever made them had been walking around and around the tent for hours. The prints were recent, maybe a few hours old at most based on how sharp the edges were, which meant whoever made them had been here this morning, possibly while I was hiking up the trail. But the really disturbing part was that all the prints stayed about 10 feet from the tent, never closer, like there was an invisible boundary they wouldn't cross. I got on my radio again, tried different channels, even tried my cell phone even though I knew there was no signal this deep in the park, but nothing worked. The responsible thing would have been to hike back immediately and report what I'd found, but I kept thinking about Lena, about the possibility that she might still be out there, injured or lost, needing help. Plus, it would take me at least 4 hours to get back to the ranger station, and by then it would be getting dark. I made the decision to secure her campsite, take photos of everything with my digital camera, and then do a broader search of the area before heading back. I started by walking a grid pattern through the forest, marking trees with orange surveyor's tape so I wouldn't get lost, calling out regularly, stopping every few minutes to listen. About 200 yards from the campsite, I found a cluster of fallen logs arranged in a rough circle, and in the center, scattered on the ground, were pieces of clothing, a rain jacket, hiking boots, wool socks, all women's sizes, all looking like they'd been carefully placed rather than dropped in panic. The jacket had Lena's name written on the tag in permanent marker, and the boots matched the size listed on her permit, but everything was completely clean, no mud, no moisture, like they'd been carefully washed and dried before being placed there. I photographed everything from multiple angles, my mind racing through possible explanations. Maybe she'd had some kind of breakdown. Maybe there was a group of people living illegally in the park. Maybe this was some kind of elaborate hoax. But none of it made sense with what I was seeing. Then I heard the voices again, much louder this time, and definitely coming from multiple directions at once, surrounding me in a rough semicircle. They were still conversational, almost casual, but there was something wrong with the rhythm, like when you slow down audio just slightly and the pitch drops, but the words stay the same. I spun around, trying to spot whoever was out there, and for just a second, I swear I saw movement between the trees, several figures walking parallel to each other, maintaining perfect spacing like they'd rehearsed it. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing. That's when I decided to get the hell out of there. Forget the search, forget protocol, just get back to civilization and let the proper authorities handle whatever this was. I started back toward Lena's campsite to grab her pack as evidence, moving fast, but trying not to run because running in the rainforest is a good way to break an ankle or worse. The voices followed me, maintaining that same conversational tone, never getting louder or quieter regardless of how fast I moved, and I could hear branches snapping somewhere behind me, steady and rhythmic like footsteps, but too synchronized, like multiple people walking in perfect unison. When I reached the campsite, I grabbed Lena's backpack, shoved her journal and phone into my own pack, and started down the trail toward the parking area. But after about 50 yards, I stopped dead because there, right in the middle of the trail where I'd walked just hours before, were more of those drag marks, fresh ones. The moss still spring back at the edges, leading off the trail in the opposite direction from where I'd found the clothes. I stood there breathing hard, trying to decide whether to follow these new marks or keep heading for safety, when I heard something that made every muscle in my body tense up. My own voice, clear as day, calling out from somewhere deeper in the forest, saying the exact words I'd used earlier when searching for Lena. Not an echo, not distorted, but perfectly clear, like a recording being played back through high-quality speakers hidden in the trees. Then another voice joined it, also mine but from a different direction, repeating my words from when I'd first found the tent, even mimicking the slight crack in my voice when I'd said her name. More voices added to the chorus, all mine, all from different moments during my search, overlapping and creating this horrible cacophony of myself talking to myself from every direction. I'm not ashamed to admit that I ran then, full sprint down that trail, branches whipping at my face, my pack bouncing painfully against my spine, those voices keeping pace with me effortlessly, now mixing in what sounded like Lena's voice too, though I'd never heard her speak, just fragments of words and phrases that might have been hers from before she disappeared. I ran for maybe 2 miles before my lungs forced me to stop, doubled over on the trail, gasping for air, and that's when I realized the voices had stopped, cut off mid-word like someone had pulled the plug on a stereo system. The normal forest sounds were back, birds chirping, squirrels chattering, the wind moving through the canopy. And for a moment I thought maybe I'd imagined it all. Maybe I was having some kind of panic attack or hallucination brought on by finding that abandoned campsite. But then I looked down at my boots and saw that they were covered in that same dark soil that had been exposed by the drag marks, even though I'd been careful to stay on the trail. I made it back to my truck just before dark, drove straight to the ranger station, and reported everything to the head ranger, who called in a full search and rescue team. They found Lena's campsite exactly as I described it, found the drag marks, even found some of the footprints, but no trace of Lena herself or the clothes I'd photographed at that circle of logs, which were somehow gone even though I had the pictures to prove they'd been there. The search went on for 2 weeks, with dogs, helicopters, even volunteer cavers checking the underground systems in the area, but Lena McCarthy was never found, and neither was any explanation for what I experienced that day. The official report lists her as missing, presumed lost in the wilderness, but I know there's more to it than that. And I think the Rangers know it too, even if they won't say it officially. I quit my job as a wilderness guide 3 weeks after the incident. Couldn't bring myself to lead people into those woods knowing what might be out there, watching, listening, copying our voices for reasons I don't want to understand. The Park Service quietly updated their protocols after that, now requiring all backcountry hikers to check in via satellite phone every 12 hours. and they've stopped issuing solo permits for that section of the trail, though they claim it's just due to increased bear activity. I still have the photos on my camera, the ones of the drag marks in Lena's clothes arranged in that circle, and sometimes I study them looking for something I missed, some clue that would make it all make sense. But the truth is, I don't think I want to know what really happened to Lena, because the only explanations that fit what I saw and heard that day are worse than not knowing at all. I've moved to Arizona now, about as far from the rainforest as I could get, and I sleep better in the desert, where you can see for miles in every direction, and voices don't hide in the trees. Oregon has always been home to me, and at 32, I'd spent most weekends exploring every trail within 100 miles of Bend. That Saturday in early September started like any other hiking day, except for the weather advisory warning about a storm system moving in from the Pacific. The forecast said it wouldn't hit until late evening, which gave me a solid 6-hour window for what should have been a 3-hour loop on the Cougar Trail. The path runs through some of the most pristine sections of the Deschutes Wilderness, winding between old-growth pines and volcanic rock formations that make you feel like you're walking through prehistoric times. I'd done this particular route maybe 15 times before, knew every switchback, every creek crossing, even had nicknames for some of the more distinctive boulders along the way. The trailhead parking area was completely empty when I pulled up around noon, which wasn't unusual for early fall when most casual hikers had already shifted to easier trails closer to town. I actually preferred it this way. Just me, my well-worn Osprey pack with the duct-taped shoulder strap, and the kind of silence you only get when you're miles from the nearest road. The air had that electric quality that comes before a big storm, making everything smell sharper, more alive. Pine resin, damp earth, that metallic tang that makes animals restless. I remember standing at the wooden trail marker, adjusting my pack straps and noticing how the birds had gone quiet. Not even the usual chatter of Steller's jays that normally followed hikers hoping for dropped trail mix. Should have paid more attention to that detail, but I was too focused on beating the weather, too confident in my ability to handle whatever the mountain might throw at me. The first mile went exactly as expected. Steady climb through Douglas firs, my breathing settling into that familiar rhythm that comes with years of conditioning. I passed the spot where lightning had split an ancient ponderosa clean in half 2 winters ago, its blackened trunk now home to woodpeckers and carpenter ants. The trail curved around a massive basalt outcropping that locals call Devil's Thumb, though it looks more like a giant fist to me. About 40 minutes in, I stopped at the creek crossing to refill my water bottle, and that's when I noticed the first weird thing. The usual muddy area where deer came down to drink was covered in fresh tracks, but they were all heading the same direction, away from the mountain, toward the lower elevations. Not just deer either. I could make out raccoon prints, what looked like coyote, even the distinctive pad marks of a black bear. All of them moving downhill, like something had spooked every animal in a 5-mile radius during the night. I actually took a photo of those tracks with my phone, thinking it would make an interesting post for my hiking group later. The image is still there in my cloud storage. Dozens of overlapping prints in the dark mud, all pointing the same direction like arrows warning me to turn around. But I kept going, telling myself it was just the approaching storm making the wildlife nervous. Another half-mile up, the trail narrowed between 2 van-sized boulders, creating this natural gateway that always made me feel like I was entering another world. Usually there were chipmunks darting across the rocks here, but today there was nothing, just the sound of wind starting to pick up in the canopy above. The temperature had dropped maybe 10 degrees since I'd started, and I pulled on my fleece jacket, the bright orange one my sister had given me specifically so hunters wouldn't mistake me for anything else. Funny how that detail would become important later, though not in the way anyone would expect. At mile marker 2, where the trail splits between the summit route and the lower loop, I found something that made me stop dead in my tracks. There were fresh scratches on the trees, not just on one, but on maybe 7 or 8 Douglas firs in a rough circle around the trail junction. These weren't random marks. They were deliberate, deep gouges that had torn through the bark down to the white wood underneath. Each set started about 7 feet up and raked downward in parallel lines, 4 grooves at a time. The sap was still wet, beating up like blood from fresh wounds. I've seen bear markings before. They usually scratch to mark territory or just to stretch, but these were different. Too high for a black bear standing on its hind legs, and the spacing between the claw marks was wider than my outstretched hand. Mountain lions will sometimes scratch trees, but not like this, not in a pattern that seemed almost territorial, almost like a warning. The weirdest part was how fresh everything looked. The wood chips were still scattered on the ground, some still clinging to the rough bark by threads of cambium. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just staring at those marks and trying to make sense of them. Part of my brain was already screaming at me to turn around, but the rational side kept making excuses. Maybe it was a particularly large bear. Maybe multiple animals had marked the same trees. Maybe some idiot with a cultivator tool had come through trying to make fake cougar signs for social media. You know how your mind works over time to normalize things that don't fit? That's exactly what mine was doing. I even convinced myself to keep going by reasoning that whatever had made those marks was probably long gone, had probably made them during the night when fleeing with all the other animals. The summit route would take me higher up the mountain for another 2 miles before looping back, while the lower trail would get me back to my car, faster but through denser forest. I chose to continue up, figuring the open meadows near the summit would give me better visibility. I pulled out my phone to check the time, just after 2 in the afternoon, and noticed I only had 1 bar of signal. Took another photo of the claw marks, then sent a quick text to my roommate. Weird markings on trees at Cougar Trail Junction, probably just bears being dramatic, should be back by 5. The message showed as delivered, but looking back at my phone records later, it never actually went through. The next 30 minutes were when everything started going sideways, though I didn't realize how bad things were getting until it was almost too late. The trail got steeper, winding through sections of fallen logs from a wildfire years back, and I had to focus on my footing more than usual. But even with my eyes on the ground, I couldn't ignore this growing sensation of being watched, not just observed, actively tracked. Every instinct I'd developed over years of solo hiking was firing off like alarm bells. When you spend enough time in the wilderness, you develop a 6th sense for when you're sharing space with a predator. Your body knows before your brain catches up, the way your shoulders tense, how your hearing suddenly sharpens to pick up every snapped twig, every rustle in the underbrush. I started doing these casual lookbacks, pretending to admire the view while actually scanning the trail behind me. Nothing visible, but twice I caught movement in my peripheral vision, just a flash of tawny brown that could have been anything. A deer, a dead branch swaying, my imagination running wild. The forest had gone completely silent except for my own footsteps and breathing, which seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. Then I heard it. A low, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl, more like a deep purr amplified through a massive chest. The sound came from somewhere above me and to the left, maybe 30 yards into the trees. I've heard mountain lions on documentaries, even once at a wildlife sanctuary, but this was different, deeper, more resonant, almost like it was coming from something bigger than any cougar I knew existed in Oregon. My legs wanted to run, every muscle coiled and ready to sprint, but I forced myself to keep walking at the same pace. Running from a predator triggers their chase instinct. That's basic survival knowledge. Instead, I started making noise, lots of it. Talking loudly to myself about absolutely nothing, commenting on the trees, the weather, rattling my water bottle against my pack. Just another hiker here. Nothing interesting, definitely not prey. That kind of desperate monologue you do when you're trying to convince yourself as much as whatever's out there. I pulled out my phone again, thinking maybe I could call for help, but the signal was completely gone. Did manage to start recording a video, holding the phone up like somehow documenting this would protect me. The footage from that attempt is shaky, mostly showing tree trunks and my orange jacket sleeve. But if you turn the volume way up, you can hear that purring sound in the background, following along as I moved up the trail. The attack happened at the switchback near the ridge, where the trail makes a sharp turn around a granite boulder the size of a small house. I came around the corner, and there it was. Not charging, not hiding, just standing in the middle of the trail about 20 feet ahead. To this day, I have trouble describing exactly what I saw because my brain kept trying to categorize it as a mountain lion, but nothing about the proportions was right. This thing was massive, probably 250 pounds of pure muscle, with shoulders that came up to my chest. Its coat was the standard tawny color, but with these strange darker markings along its spine, almost like stripes that had been smudged. But it was the eyes that made everything inside me go cold. They were reflecting the afternoon light in this unnatural green-gold color, too intelligent, too focused, like it was studying me rather than just seeing prey. We stood there staring at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 seconds. Then it did something I'll never forget. It smiled, or at least that's what it looked like. Its lips pulled back, showing teeth that were way too long for any cougar, and it made that purring sound again. But now I could see its throat vibrating with it. My hand was still holding my phone up, recording everything, though I wasn't conscious of it anymore. That 8-second final video everyone talks about? That was this moment, though the quality is so bad from my shaking that you can barely make out more than those glowing eyes. I don't remember making the decision to run. 1 second I was frozen there. The next I was crashing through the underbrush off the trail, my pack bouncing against my back, branches tearing at my jacket and face. Behind me I heard it follow, not running but moving through the forest with this horrible leisurely pace, like it knew I couldn't get away. I stumbled over a root, went down hard, and that's when I felt the first swipe across my backpack. The claws went through the fabric like paper, and I felt the straps give way. I shrugged out of it and kept running, heard it stop to investigate what I'd dropped. That probably bought me 30 seconds. My map was in that pack's side pocket, and when search and rescue found it later, it had been methodically shredded, like something with opposable thumbs had pulled it out and torn it apart piece by piece. They also found my water bottle 20 yards away, punctured by what they initially thought were knife marks until they measured the spacing. I made it another 100 yards before I realized the sounds behind me had stopped. Not gone away. Stopped, like it had just decided to let me go. I didn't stop running until I hit the lower trail, then basically fell down the last mile to the parking area. My car was still the only one in the lot when I burst out of the trees, gasping and covered in scratches from my off-trail crash. The storm was starting to roll in, dark clouds eating up the sky, and the first fat raindrops were hitting the gravel. I fumbled with my keys for what felt like forever, kept looking back at the tree line expecting to see those green-gold eyes watching me. Nothing there, but I could feel it, still up on the mountain, still aware of exactly where I was. I drove straight to the ranger station in town. Must have looked absolutely insane walking in there, wild-eyed and bleeding, trying to explain what had happened. The ranger on duty, an older guy named Frank who'd been working the Deschutes for 20 years, took one look at me and called for backup. Not because he didn't believe me, because he did. Turns out there had been 3 other reports in the past month, all from experienced hikers, all describing the same thing. Abnormally large cougar, unusual markings, intelligent behavior that didn't match any known wildlife patterns. They'd been keeping it quiet to avoid panic, but they had a whole task force working on it. Frank showed me a cast they'd made of tracks found near another encounter. The paw print was almost 8 inches across, nearly twice the size of a normal mountain lion. They closed the cougar trail the next day, officially for storm damage assessment, but it stayed closed for 3 months. During that time, 2 wildlife biologists from Oregon State University set up trail cameras all along my route and found absolutely nothing. Whatever it was had vanished, moved on, or gotten better at avoiding detection. The theory they eventually settled on was an escaped exotic pet, Maybe a cougar-leopard hybrid that someone had been keeping illegally, though that didn't explain the size or the behavioral oddities. They never found it, and the trail reopened that winter with new warning signs about aggressive wildlife and recommendations to hike in groups of 4 or more. I went back once, about a year later, with 5 other people in broad daylight. The claw marks on those trees had been cut down, removed, but you could still see the stumps where they'd chainsawed them out. Nobody talks about it officially anymore, but if you chat with the local hikers, everyone knows someone who's seen something wrong up on that mountain. I still hike, but never alone, never that trail, and never without enough gear to make myself look as big and loud as possible. Sometimes at night when it's really quiet, I can still hear that purring sound in my memory, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for the next solo hiker who thinks they know these woods. November of 2018 was when everything in my life seemed to finally fall into place. I'd just landed a job as a software developer at a tech startup in Bellevue after years of grinding through contract work, and my girlfriend Jamie and I were driving back from visiting her parents in Spokane for Thanksgiving weekend. The drive through Snoqualmie Pass usually took about 4 hours, but we'd left late Sunday afternoon, hoping to avoid the worst of the holiday traffic. Jamie dozed in the passenger seat while I navigated the winding mountain roads, the sunset painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of orange and purple. We'd been together for 3 years, and I had an engagement ring hidden in my apartment back home, planning to propose on New Year's Eve. Most of my friends from college were already married with kids by then, but Jamie and I had taken our time, made sure we were ready. Life felt perfect, predictable even, in that comfortable way where you think nothing truly bad could ever touch you. The sun had just dipped below the mountain ridges when I spotted it. This old white van, maybe from the early 90s, pulled halfway off the road and partially hidden among the Douglas firs. What caught my attention wasn't just the awkward angle it was parked at, like someone had yanked the wheel hard to the right in a panic, but the way the driver's door hung wide open, interior light casting a weak yellow glow onto the pine needles below. I'd driven this past dozens of times for work and camping trips, and you learn pretty quick that leaving your vehicle like that in November, with temperatures dropping below freezing at night, meant either someone was in serious trouble or they'd abandoned it in a real hurry. Jamie stirred when I slowed down, rubbing her eyes and asking why we were stopping. I told her someone might need help, and she immediately agreed we should check. That was Jamie, always ready to help a stranger, always seeing the good in people before considering any danger. I pulled our Subaru behind the van, leaving maybe 20 feet between us, and kept the engine running with the headlights on high beam. The van's license plate was caked with mud, but I could make out that it was from Idaho, one of those old yellow and blue ones they stopped making years ago. Jamie grabbed her phone to use as a flashlight, while I walked toward the open door, calling out, "Hello? Anyone need help?" into the growing darkness. The silence that answered back wasn't normal forest quiet. You know how the woods usually have some background noise, birds settling for the night, wind through branches, small animals rustling in the undergrowth. This was different, like the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. The van's interior light illuminated worn gray seats and a dashboard covered in fast food wrappers and empty coffee cups. But what made me stop dead was the CB radio mounted above the rearview mirror, its red power light still glowing, and a voice crackling through the static every few seconds saying numbers in sequence. 47 12 91, 47 12 91. That's when Jamie grabbed my arm and pointed at the ground near the van's rear tires. There were shoes scattered in the dirt and pine needles. Little kids' shoes, maybe size 3 or 4, the kind with cartoon characters and light-up soles that flash when you walk. 5 or 6 pairs at least, some tossed carelessly, others lined up neat like someone had placed them there deliberately. One pink sneaker with unicorns on the side had fresh mud on the bottom, like whoever wore it had just been walking around. I reached out to touch the van's hood and jerked my hand back. The engine was still warm, couldn't have been off for more than 15 or 20 minutes. Jamie whispered that we should call 911 right away, but when she looked at her phone, she had no signal, which wasn't unusual for that stretch of the pass, but felt particularly unnerving given what we were seeing. The numbers on the CB radio kept repeating, and now I noticed something else. There were scratches on the inside of the van's back doors, deep gouges in the metal like someone had been trying to claw their way out. We should have left right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back in our car and drive away, but Jamie was already walking around the van with her phone's flashlight, documenting everything, saying we needed evidence for the police. She found more shoes leading into the tree line, creating this bizarre trail that disappeared into the darkness between the massive fir trunks. Some were placed in pairs, toes pointing toward the forest. Others were single shoes dropped at odd angles. The weirdest part was that they all looked relatively new, no wear on the soles, price tags still attached to some of them. Jamie bent down to examine a tiny blue sneaker when we heard it, footsteps crunching through the undergrowth, maybe 30 yards into the forest, slow and deliberate like someone was carefully picking their way through the trees. I called out again. "Hello? Is someone there? Do you need help?" But the footsteps stopped immediately, like whoever it was had frozen in place the second they heard my voice. The CB radio suddenly squealed with feedback, making us both jump. And then a different voice came through, crystal clear this time. "They're looking at the shoes. Both of them. The woman has brown hair and a ponytail. The man is wearing a green jacket." Jamie went rigid beside me, her ponytail swaying as she spun around to stare at the radio. I was wearing my old Columbia jacket, forest green, the one Jamie always teased me about because it made me look like a park ranger. Whoever was on that radio could see us, was watching us right now from somewhere in the darkness. The voice continued, flat and emotionless like someone reading from a script. "Vehicle is a blue Subaru Outback. License plate starts with BX7. 2 subjects appear unarmed. No other vehicles visible on the road." My mouth went completely dry as I realized they were describing us, our car, giving some kind of report to someone else, and the level of detail meant they had to be close, maybe with binoculars or night vision gear. Jamie yanked my arm hard, pulling me back toward our car, and that's when I saw them. 2 figures standing perfectly still among the trees, maybe 40 feet from us. They were wearing what looked like hazmat suits, those white full-body ones you see in movies about disease outbreaks, but modified with dark patches on the knees and elbows. Their faces were covered with respirators and tinted goggles that reflected our headlights like animal eyes. One of them held what appeared to be a large butterfly net, except the netting was made of chain link, and the other had something that looked like a modified catch pole, the kind animal control uses, but with multiple loops at the end. They weren't moving toward us, just standing there, watching, their heads tilted at identical angles like they were waiting for instructions. Behind them, deeper in the forest, I could make out more white shapes moving between the trees, at least 4 or 5 others spread out in what seemed like a search pattern. Without warning, one of them raised their hand and made 3 quick gestures, pointing at us, then at the van, then drawing a circle in the air. The others immediately started moving, not toward us but fanning out to the sides, and I realized with absolute clarity that they were trying to surround us, cut off our escape route back to the car. Jamie was already running, and I sprinted after her, my boots slipping on the wet pine needles as we crashed through the 20 feet of space between us and the Subaru. I could hear them behind us now, not running but walking fast, their equipment jangling with each step, and that damn CB radio voice narrating everything. "Subjects are returning to vehicle, moving to containment position 3. Jamie dove into the passenger seat while I fumbled with the keys, my fingers suddenly clumsy and useless. And through the side mirror I saw one of them pull something from their belt that looked like a small fire extinguisher, except the nozzle was shaped wrong, more like a spray paint can with a cone attached. The engine turned over on the 3rd try and I threw it in reverse, nearly clipping the white van as I spun the wheel hard to get us back on the road. 2 of the suited figures had made it to the pavement, standing in the middle of the lane with their arms spread wide like they expected me to stop. But I swerved around them, tires screaming against the asphalt. Jamie was twisted in her seat, watching through the back window, and she gasped when one of them threw something at our car. It hit the rear windshield with a wet splat, spreading some kind of thick, clear gel that immediately started crystallizing, creating spiderweb patterns across the glass that made it impossible to see through. The speedometer hit 60 on the narrow mountain road, way too fast for those curves, but I didn't care. We needed distance between us and whatever the hell those people were doing. Jamie kept saying, "What was that? What were they doing with those kids' shoes?" Over and over, her voice getting higher with each repetition, and I didn't have answers, just this overwhelming need to get us somewhere with cell service so we could call for help. About 2 miles down the road, my phone suddenly lit up with notifications. We had signal again. Jamie immediately called 911 while I pulled into a well-lit gas station, parking right in front of the doors where the cameras could see us. The dispatcher took our report, said units were already responding to an incident at that location, which made me wonder who else had called it in. While we waited, I noticed that gel stuff on our back window was dissolving on its own, leaving no trace except a slight warping in the glass like heat damage. The police showed up 20 minutes later, 2 state troopers who looked skeptical until they saw our faces, saw how genuinely terrified we were. They said they'd found the van exactly where we described it, but it was completely empty. No shoes, no CB radio, nothing but standard vehicle registration belonging to some guy in Boise who'd reported it stolen 3 weeks ago. No signs of anyone in hazmat suits, no unusual footprints, nothing to corroborate our story except our obvious distress and that strange damage to our rear window. The trooper taking our statement, Officer Brennan, kept asking if we'd gotten any photos or videos, but Jamie's phone had somehow corrupted all the pictures she'd taken, just black squares with error messages when you tried to open them. Brennan did mention something that made my skin prickle, though. There'd been 3 other reports in the past month about unusual activity along that stretch of road, always involving abandoned vehicles and strange sightings, but never any solid evidence. He showed us a printout from another incident report where a truck driver described seeing kids' clothing arranged in patterns near mile marker 48, right where we'd stopped. But when deputies investigated, they found nothing. The other trooper pulled Brennan aside for a private conversation, and I overheard him mention something about federal jurisdiction and waiting for the liaison, which Brennan shut down quick with a look that said not in front of the civilians. They gave us their cards, took our contact information, and strongly suggested we take Interstate 90 next time instead of the pass road, especially after dark. We drove home in silence, Jamie gripping my hand tight the whole way, both of us checking the mirrors constantly. For weeks afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about those children's shoes, all brand new, all sized for kids between maybe 4 and 7 years old. I did research online, spent hours going down rabbit holes about missing children in Washington and Idaho, but found nothing that matched what we'd seen. Jamie had nightmares about those figures in white suits, would wake up gasping about being chased through the forest with nets. Then, about a month later, I got a call from a blocked number, just breathing at first, then that same flat voice from the CB radio. "Stop searching. Stop talking about it. Your curiosity has been noted." They hung up before I could respond. We never drove through Snoqualmie Pass again, started taking the long way around even if it added 2 hours to our trip. Jamie and I broke up 6 months later. She couldn't handle the fear, the not knowing, the way I obsessed over finding answers. The engagement ring is still in my desk drawer, and sometimes late at night, I wonder if those kids whose shoes we found are somewhere out there, barefoot and scared, or if those shoes were all that was left of them. The not knowing is what gets you in the end. That and the certainty that somewhere out there, those people in white suits are still doing whatever it was we interrupted that night. Jason kept checking his altimeter every 10 minutes, like the numbers would somehow change if he stared at them hard enough. We were pushing through the scree field above Pumice Creek when he finally voiced what we'd both been thinking. Those clouds rolling in from the west weren't supposed to be there. The forecast had been bulletproof. 5 days of high pressure that should have given us the perfect summit window for Glacier Peak. But mountains don't care about forecasts, and by the time we reached our planned camp at 7,000 feet, the temperature had already dropped 15 degrees from what it should have been. Setting up the tent became a race against the wind that came out of nowhere, turning what should have been a 10-minute task into a wrestling match with fabric and poles. Jason actually laughed when the first gust nearly ripped the rainfly from my hands, said something about how his wife would kill him if she knew conditions were already going sideways on day one. That night changed everything. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound that didn't belong. Not the wind battering our tent, which had gotten strong enough to bow the poles inward with each gust, but something else underneath it. Like footsteps in the snow, except heavier, more deliberate. Jason was still out cold in his sleeping bag, snoring despite the chaos outside, so I just lay there listening, trying to convince myself it was just chunks of ice falling from the seracs above us. The sound circled our tent 3 times, always maintaining the same measured pace before stopping directly outside the vestibule. Then nothing. Just the wind screaming across the glacier and my heart hammering so hard I thought it might wake Jason up. When morning finally came, I unzipped the tent to find the storm had arrived in full force. Visibility maybe 20 feet, snow coming sideways, our tracks from yesterday completely erased. We needed to descend immediately. That much was obvious. But Jason wanted to wait a few hours, see if the storm would break. He'd checked the satellite weather the night before and swore this system wasn't supposed to hit until Wednesday at the earliest. While we argued about it, brewing instant coffee in the vestibule and trying to keep the stove flame from getting blown out, I mentioned the sounds from the night before. Jason just looked at me with this expression I'd never seen on him before, kind of pale and uncertain. Turns out he'd been awake too, had heard the whole thing, but figured I was asleep and didn't want to freak me out. The way he described it made my skin prickle. He said it sounded like something was testing our tent, pressing against different sections of the fabric, looking for weak spots. We both tried to rationalize it, maybe a curious mountain goat or even a bear that hadn't gone into hibernation yet. Though we both knew bears didn't come up this high, and mountain goats didn't behave like that. The decision got made for us when the wind suddenly gusted hard enough to snap one of our tent poles with a crack like a gunshot. We were packed and moving within 15 minutes, roping up even though we could barely see each other through the whiteout. The descent should have been straightforward. We'd marked our route with wands on the way up, and Jason had GPS waypoints for every major feature. But the storm had transformed everything into an alien landscape. Snowdrifts had built up in places that were clear yesterday, and what looked like solid ground would suddenly give way to hidden crevasses filled with fresh powder. After 2 hours of fighting through conditions that kept getting worse, we realized we'd somehow gotten off route. The GPS showed us 500 feet east of where we should have been, in a section of glacier we hadn't explored on the way up. That's when Jason spotted the cave, really just a bergschrund that had opened up between the glacier and the rock face, but it offered shelter from the wind that was literally knocking us off our feet. Inside the bergschrund, the silence felt wrong after hours of wind screaming in our ears. We set up the damaged tent as best we could, using ice screws and creative rigging to compensate for the broken pole, while our headlamps threw wild shadows on the blue ice walls around us. Jason kept trying to get a signal on the satellite communicator to let someone know we were okay, but off route. The device just kept searching, unable to punch through the storm and tons of ice above us. We figured we'd wait out the worst of it, maybe 12 hours, then make another push for the descent. But while we were melting snow for water, Jason grabbed my arm and pointed his headlamp toward the back of the cave. There were tracks in the frost on the ice floor. Not our boot prints, but something else, like elongated bare feet with toes that seemed too long, heading deeper into the darkness where the bergschrund narrowed into a crack. Jason tried to joke that maybe someone else had taken shelter here earlier, but his voice cracked halfway through, and we both knew those prints looked fresh, the edges still sharp and defined. Neither of us wanted to explore deeper into that cave. But we also couldn't leave. The storm outside had turned into a full Arctic blast that would kill us in hours. We decided to take shifts staying awake, keeping watch while the other tried to sleep. During my first watch, around what must have been early evening, though it was impossible to tell in the permanent twilight of the storm, I heard it again, that same measured, heavy movement from the night before. But this time it was coming from inside the cave, from that narrow crack where the tracks led. The sound would approach, slow and deliberate, until it was maybe 30 feet away, just beyond where our headlamp beams could reach. Then it would stop for 10-15 minutes before retreating back into the darkness. Each time it came closer, lingered longer. I woke Jason after the third approach, and we both sat there, ice axes in hand, staring into that black gap while our breath clouded in the freezing air. Jason whispered that we needed to move, storm or no storm, but right as he said it, something scraped against the ice right at the edge of our light, a sound like fingernails but much larger, dragging slowly across the frozen surface. We grabbed our packs and bolted out of that cave so fast I don't even remember putting on my crampons. The storm hit us like a physical wall, visibility down to maybe 10 feet, wind strong enough that we had to lean into it just to stay upright. Jason took the lead on the rope, using the GPS to navigate while I followed, both of us moving way too fast for conditions that bad. Every few minutes, one of us would punch through a snow bridge or lose footing on the ice, saved only by the rope between us. But we didn't slow down, couldn't slow down, because even through the howling wind we could hear something behind us. Not footsteps exactly, more like something heavy being dragged across the ice, getting closer whenever we stopped to check the GPS or catch our breath. At one point, Jason's crampon got stuck in a crack, and while he was freeing it, I turned around with my headlamp and saw a shape in the snow maybe 20 feet back. Tall, much taller than a person should be, with proportions that looked wrong, arms too long, moving in this jerky, unnatural way like it wasn't used to walking upright. The next few hours blend together in my memory like a nightmare you can't quite recall in detail. We descended blind through the whiteout, following GPS bearings that led us through terrain we didn't recognize, rappelling off ice walls we couldn't properly assess, taking risks that would have been suicidal in any other circumstance. Jason's altimeter showed we were losing elevation fast, but nothing looked familiar. The storm had erased all our wands, covered our tracks, turned the entire mountain into a maze of false leads and dead ends. Somewhere during that descent, I think around midnight based on Jason's watch, we got separated. One moment the rope was taut between us, the next it went slack. I pulled and pulled but just got more rope, until I reached the end and found it had been cut clean through. The ends frayed like something had bitten through the core. I screamed Jason's name until my throat went raw, but the wind swallowed everything. I was alone on that glacier with whatever had been following us, in a whiteout so complete I couldn't see my own feet. Training kicked in before panic could take over completely. Find shelter, stay put, wait for the storm to break. That's what every mountaineering course teaches you. I used my ice axe to probe ahead, found a wind lip in the glacier where I could dig out a small snow cave. My fingers were going numb inside my gloves as I hollowed out just enough space to squeeze inside with my pack. The satellite communicator still showed no signal. The GPS showed my elevation at around 9,000 feet, but the coordinates meant nothing without landmarks to reference. I forced myself to eat something, melt snow for water, all the mechanical survival tasks that keep you from thinking too hard about the situation. But then I heard breathing outside my snow cave, deep, rhythmic, definitely not wind. Something was circling my shelter, and occasionally I'd hear what sounded like sniffing, like a dog trying to catch a scent, except the sound was coming from at least 7 feet off the ground. I turned off my headlamp and sat in complete darkness, ice axe gripped so tight my forearms cramped, listening to that thing pace around my cave for what felt like hours. Dawn never really came. The storm just shifted from black to gray. The wind dropped from lethal to merely dangerous. When I finally worked up the courage to crawl out of my snow cave, the first thing I saw were tracks everywhere around my shelter. Hundreds of them, like whatever it was, had been agitated, pacing frantically. But these tracks were different from what we'd seen in the Bergeschrund. Some looked almost human, others were those same elongated prints, and some were just deep gouges in the snow like something had been walking on all fours. I started descending again, moving fast but careful, following what I hoped was the fall line that would eventually lead to tree line and safety. The visibility improved to maybe 50 feet, and that's when I found Jason's jacket. It was torn to pieces, hanging from an ice formation like a flag, the fabric shredded in parallel lines that looked deliberate, methodical. No blood, no body, just the jacket and his GPS unit lying in the snow, still showing our plotted route. I grabbed the GPS and kept moving, trying not to think about what those claw marks in the fabric meant, trying not to notice that something was still following me, staying just outside my field of vision in the swirling snow. The tree line saved my life. After 6 more hours of desperate descending, crashing through wind-loaded slopes that could have avalanched at any moment, I finally hit the first scraggly mountain hemlocks. Whatever had been following me stopped at the trees. I could feel it watching from up on the glacier, but it wouldn't come into the forest. I didn't stop moving until I reached the trail junction at Kennedy Ridge, where I collapsed next to the wilderness permit box and finally got a signal on the satellite communicator. Search and rescue found me there 8 hours later, hypothermic and babbling about Jason still being up on the mountain. They launched a massive search that went on for 5 days once the storm cleared. They found our shredded tent right where I said it would be, found the Bergeschrund with those strange tracks already half filled with new snow, found scraps of Jason's clothing scattered across a quarter-mile of glacier. But they never found Jason. The official report blamed the separation on whiteout conditions and suggested he fell into a crevasse, his body likely buried under tons of avalanche debris. They didn't mention the tracks in their report, said the photos I'd taken were too blurry to make out anything definitive, just wind patterns in the snow. I went back to Kennedy Ridge 2 months later, on a clear day in early autumn when you could see Glacier Peak perfectly against the blue sky. Brought binoculars and spent hours scanning the glacier where everything happened. And I saw it, just once, for maybe 10 seconds before it disappeared behind a serac. That same tall, wrong-shaped figure moving across the ice in broad daylight with those jerky, unnatural movements. But here's what really haunts me. It was wearing Jason's red Summit jacket, the one he always wore for photographs at the top. The thing wearing his jacket stopped and turned toward me, like it knew I was watching from 5 miles away. Then it raised one of those 2 long arms in what looked like a wave before disappearing into the ice. I haven't been back to the mountains since. I tell people it's because I lost my climbing partner, which is true enough. But the real reason is that sometimes, on cold nights when the wind picks up, I can still hear those careful, measured footsteps circling my house, and I know that one day, when the conditions are just right, it's going to come looking for the one that got away. "26 years old, and 6 months into my job with the Forest Service, the solitude of the wilderness had become exactly what I needed after my divorce. It was early June when they handed me the assignment to inspect the trail system near Ape Canyon, on the northeast side of Mount St. Helens. The area had been closed since winter due to some severe storm damage, and with hiking season ramping up, they needed someone to assess whether the trails were safe for public use again. My supervisor, a weathered guy named Bill who'd been with the service for 3 decades, pulled me aside before I left and told me the locals had been calling in complaints about strange noises coming from that area. Probably just elk or maybe some loose rocks from the spring thaw, he said, but his eyes didn't quite meet mine when he said it. The drive up took about 3 hours from the ranger station, winding through increasingly narrow roads until I reached the trailhead parking area, completely empty except for my government-issued pickup truck. The morning started normally enough, I remember, because I made a point to log everything in my field notebook. Standard procedure for solo inspections. Started hiking at 7:30 sharp, temperature around 55 degrees, light cloud cover moving in from the west. The first 2 miles of trail were in decent shape. Just some typical erosion and a few downed branches I could clear myself. But as I got deeper into the canyon, following the path that runs parallel to Muddy River, things started to feel different in a way I still struggle to describe. The forest there is old growth, massive Douglas firs and hemlocks that block out most of the sunlight even on clear days. But that morning it felt especially dark, like the trees were crowding in closer than they should. About 3 miles in, I found the first real damage. A section of trail completely obliterated by what looked like a landslide, except the debris pattern made no sense. Rocks and logs scattered uphill from the trail, which goes against basic physics unless something threw them there. I radioed back to base around 9:15 to report the trail damage, and that's when I heard them for the first time. Voices, distant but unmistakably human, calling out from somewhere deeper in the canyon. They weren't hikers. The area had been closed for months and I'd seen the locked gate myself at the access road. The voices seemed to bounce off the canyon walls in this weird way that made it impossible to pinpoint their direction. But what really got to me was that they were calling my name. Not hello or help or any of the things you'd expect from someone lost or in trouble, but Caleb specifically, drawn out and repeated like they were trying to get my attention. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, radio in hand, trying to make sense of it while Bill's voice crackled through asking if I needed backup. Told him I was investigating possible unauthorized hikers and would check back in 30 minutes. Standard protocol for unexpected contact in restricted areas. The voices grew clearer as I pushed through a section of Devil's Club and salmonberry bushes that had overgrown the trail since winter. They weren't exactly louder, but more distinct, like whoever was calling had figured out the perfect frequency to cut through the forest noise. My name echoed maybe every 30 seconds, always from a different direction, sometimes sounding like it came from the canopy above, other times seeming to rise up from the ravine below, where Muddy River churned over volcanic rocks. I kept my radio on channel 3, the emergency frequency, and marked my GPS coordinates every 100 yards or so. Training kicked in even though my mind was racing through rational explanations. Maybe it was some locals playing a prank, knowing the Forest Service would send someone up here eventually. Or possibly an acoustic phenomenon caused by the canyon's unique shape combined with the river noise. But none of that explained how they knew my name, since my assignment had been decided just yesterday afternoon in a closed meeting. Around 9:45, I reached a section where the trees opened up into a small clearing, maybe 60 feet across, and that's where I saw the markings. Every single tree surrounding the clearing, and I counted 23 of them, had these deep gouges in the bark, starting about 8 feet up and extending to nearly 15 feet off the ground. The marks were fresh, sap still oozing and sticky, forming these thick amber ribbons down the trunks. They weren't random either. 4 parallel lines, each about 2 inches apart, repeated over and over like something had systematically worked its way around the perimeter. I pulled out my field camera to document them, and through the viewfinder I noticed something else. Strips of fabric caught on the higher branches, tan and olive green like Forest Service uniforms, but weathered in a way that suggested they'd been there for weeks, not months. The voices had stopped the moment I entered the clearing, replaced by this oppressive silence where even the birds had gone quiet, just the distant sound of the river far below. I need to be clear about what happened next because I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head trying to make sense of it. While photographing the marked trees, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision, not an animal or person, but the trees themselves seeming to sway despite there being no wind. The motion started on the north side of the clearing and rippled clockwise, each tree bending slightly toward the center where I stood, their tops dipping maybe 10 or 15 degrees before straightening again. The whole sequence took maybe 20 seconds, and as the last tree on the eastern edge completed its bow, the voices returned. Except this time they weren't just calling my name. They were having a conversation, multiple distinct voices speaking in overlapping fragments that included my name, my employee ID number, details about my divorce that I'd never told anyone at work, and strangest of all, they were describing what I was wearing but getting it wrong. Describing a red jacket instead of my green one, boots I'd thrown away months ago, mentioning a wedding ring I no longer wore. The radio crackled to life with Bill's voice asking for my status update. It had been 28 minutes since my last check-in. When I pressed the talk button to respond, my own voice came through the speaker before I could say anything, except it was me from that morning, repeating the exact words I'd said to Bill when I'd first arrived at the trailhead. The transmission played for maybe 10 seconds, then cut to static, and when I tried again, pressing different combinations of buttons, switching channels, even removing and reinserting the battery, the same recording would play. The voices in the trees grew louder during each transmission, not in volume but in number, like more people were joining the conversation, and they started describing things that hadn't happened yet. Me falling on wet rocks, me finding something metal half buried in the trail, me running through underbrush with torn clothes. I decided to head back immediately, forget the rest of the trail inspection, just get to my truck and drive straight to the ranger station. The path back should have been straightforward. I'd been marking waypoints on my GPS the entire time, leaving small orange flags at trail junctions, following standard wilderness protocol. But when I turned around, the clearing had changed. Not dramatically, not impossibly, just wrong in subtle ways that made my chest tight with panic. The marked trees were there, but the gouges were older looking, filled with dried pitch and starting to heal over, months of growth sealing the wounds. The fabric strips in the branches were gone, and in their place hung something else. Survey ribbons, the bright pink ones we used for marking hazard areas, except these had dates written on them in black marker, all from different years going back to 1987, all with the same message. Caleb Meyer, found location. My GPS showed my exact position hadn't changed, still in the same coordinates I'd logged minutes ago. But the device's date display was cycling randomly through different years, the numbers blurring too fast to read. I ran. Not jogged, not walked quickly, but full-on sprinted through the undergrowth, crashing through salmonberry bushes and sliding on the damp earth, following what I thought was the trail back. The forest seemed to resist my movement. Branches that should have snapped bounced back with unusual force. Roots appeared where my feet were about to land, and the grade of the slope kept shifting like the mountain itself was breathing. Behind me, or maybe ahead or from both sides simultaneously, I could hear footsteps matching my pace perfectly, except they were slightly off rhythm, like an echo that arrives too early. The voices had changed too, no longer calling my name but having full conversations about me in the third person, discussing my personnel file, my work performance, my psychological evaluation from the hiring process, reading aloud notes that sounded exactly like Bill's writing style, but describing incidents I knew had never happened. Me getting lost for 3 days, me filing reports about temporal inconsistencies, me requesting transfers to different forests every few months. After what felt like an hour but my watch showed as only 12 minutes, I burst out onto a section of maintained trail, one with fresh gravel and new drainage channels, clearly recent work. The problem was, this trail shouldn't exist. I knew every inch of the Ape Canyon trail system from studying maps for weeks before this assignment, and this wide, professionally graded path simply wasn't on any of them. But it led downhill, toward where my truck should be, so I followed it, trying to ignore how the trail markers showed distances that made no sense, claiming I was simultaneously 2 miles and 7 miles from the trailhead. The wooden signs at intersections were all perfectly new but dated from 1980, each one listing trail conditions and warnings about recurring acoustic anomalies and temporal displacement zones, terms I'd never seen in any Forest Service documentation. My radio had gone completely dead, not even static, and when I checked my phone, which I'd kept off to preserve battery, it showed 17 missed calls from Bill, all somehow from tomorrow's date. The final stretch to the parking area was the worst part. I could see my truck through the trees exactly where I'd left it, but the forest between me and it kept stretching, adding trees that weren't there before, inserting gullies and creek beds that I had to navigate around. Other vehicles appeared and disappeared in the parking area, Forest Service trucks from different decades, personal cars I didn't recognize. once even a horse-drawn wagon that flickered in and out like a bad signal. The voices had become a roar, hundreds of them now, all discussing different versions of Caleb Meyer, Forest Ranger, some saying I'd died in 1987, others claiming I'd never been born, a few insisting I was still married, still in college, still in high school, had retired last year, was scheduled to start work next month. When I finally reached the parking area, stumbling out of the tree line covered in scratches and mud, my truck was there, but it was wrong. Same model, same color, but the license plate had digits that hurt to look at directly, like they were cycling through every possible combination simultaneously. I got in, started the engine, which sounded both perfectly normal and completely alien, and drove. The access road was the same and different. Familiar curves in unfamiliar sequences, landmarks I recognized in the wrong order or at impossible distances. The radio turned itself on, scanning through stations that were broadcasting news from various years, weather reports for dates that had passed or hadn't arrived yet, and occasionally recordings of my own voice giving trail reports I'd never made. Took either 3 hours or 30 minutes to reach the ranger station. My dashboard clock never settled on a single time. When I pulled into the parking lot, Bill was waiting outside, but when he saw me, his face went pale and he immediately called for backup on his radio, saying they'd found me, that I was back, even though from my perspective, I'd only been gone since morning. Turns out I'd been missing for 3 days. My truck found abandoned at the trailhead with all my equipment scattered around it, covered in what they described as volcanic ash from an eruption that hadn't happened. My radio broadcasting my voice on repeat, saying I could hear someone calling my name from the trees. The first time I came across that cabin was during a long day of fieldwork in the forest. I had been assigned to map out remnants of old timber roots for a conservation study, something that usually meant long hours of hiking and collecting data. It was early autumn and the air had that sharp, resinous smell of wet pine. I remember feeling a strange calm walking that deep into the forest. No cell service, no hum of traffic, only the constant chatter of birds and the crunch of moss under my boots. My partner, Drew, had gone back to the trailhead after our GPS malfunctioned, leaving me to finish one last section before dusk. That was when I noticed what looked like the edge of a roof behind a cluster of old cedar trees. The path to it was barely visible, more like a memory of a trail than something people still used. Branches hung low and wet, brushing my jacket as I pushed through. The structure appeared suddenly, half hidden under layers of moss and ivy, but still sturdy. It was a small logging cabin, maybe 12 by 16 feet, built from thick, darkened logs. What caught my eye was how clean it seemed beneath all that decay, like time had bent around it. The padlock on the door had rusted, but the hinges looked strangely new. I remember wiping the grime off the small window and feeling my heartbeat pick up when I saw what was inside. There was a lantern hanging from a beam, a steel thermos on the table, and a folded jacket draped over a chair. Everything coated in a fine layer of dust, yet untouched by animals or weather. It felt like whoever lived there had stepped out only yesterday. The air inside was thick with the smell of old tobacco and engine oil. I flipped through a stack of papers on the table and realized they were handwritten shift logs from the early 80s. The names, the notes about tree lines and equipment, all perfectly legible. I took a few photos for the report, mostly to prove it was real, because by then I already had this creeping thought that no one would believe me. I radioed Drew, but the line crackled with static. He had probably reached the truck by then, too far for the signal. I decided to mark the coordinates manually before heading back. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of something odd on the wall, a fresh set of boot prints near the door, the kind you make when stepping through damp ground. They were sharper than they should have been in a place untouched for decades. For a moment, I told myself maybe they were mine, though the spacing looked too wide, too deliberate. I left the cabin feeling both curious and uneasy, as if I had interrupted something I was not meant to see. That night, back at the motel, I uploaded the photos and typed a quick summary for our supervisor. The images looked sharper on screen than they had in person. The texture of the wood grain, the dust caught mid-air in the camera flash, even a faint reflection in the window that I could not explain. It looked almost like a face, though distorted by glare. I tried not to dwell on it. Drew read through the notes and laughed, saying maybe I had stumbled on a hermit's hideout. But the site had been decommissioned 40 years ago. No one was supposed to live anywhere near there anymore. The next morning, we drove back with 2 park officers and a local historian who had worked on forest preservation records. I led them straight to the coordinates I had marked, certain we would find the cabin exactly where it stood the day before. The trail looked the same at first, the same twisted roots and patches of fern, but the clearing where the cabin had been was empty. No walls, no logs, not even splintered wood, just churned soil and a rectangle of darker earth, like the ground still remembered where it had been. One of the officers thought it might have been dismantled long ago, but that made no sense. It had been there less than 24 hours earlier. They searched for signs of dragging or tool marks, but there were none. It looked as if the structure had simply sunk or dissolved. The historian walked the perimeter quietly before saying something that made my stomach tighten. He claimed there had been stories from old loggers about a phantom shack deep in those woods, a place where workers once stayed after an accident shut down the line in the early 80s. He said they never found the last crew who logged that section, only their tools and a half-written ledger. I could tell the officers dismissed it as folklore, but I could not shake the feeling that I had stood inside that missing camp. We stayed out there for hours, circling the clearing, hoping to find even a nail or hinge. At one point, Drew found a small patch of ash beneath the soil, faintly gray and cold to the touch, as if something had burned there long ago. I felt a strange pressure in my ears, like the air itself was heavier. The forest had gone completely quiet. No birds, no insects, only the faint whisper of wind moving through trees. When we finally decided to leave, I turned one last time to look at the clearing. For a second, I could swear I saw the outline of the cabin shimmer between the trunks, there and not there, before vanishing like mist. I did not tell anyone. Back at the ranger station, I showed the photos again, insisting that someone had to explain how an entire building could vanish overnight. One of the officers suggested I might have mistaken another site for the one we saw that morning, but the GPS coordinates matched perfectly. Drew backed me up. He had seen the cabin himself from a distance the day before. The historian asked to keep a copy of the shift logs, but when I went through my folder, they were gone. Every single photo still showed the cabin, but the papers I had collected had simply disappeared. My bag was zipped the entire time. That night, sleep did not come easily. I kept replaying the moment I stepped inside that cabin. The faint echo of dripping water, the smell of rust and wood smoke, the way the light from my headlamp had bent across the walls. Around 2 a.m, a knock came at my motel door. Not loud, just 2 slow taps like someone waiting. When I opened it, the hallway was empty, but on the floor lay a small folded piece of paper. Inside, in smudged pencil, was a single line: "You should not have taken anything." I drove back home the next morning without saying a word to Drew. Over the next week, strange things kept happening. My GPS would show coordinates deep in that same forest every time I turned it on, no matter where I was. A faint smell of oil and pine clung to my jacket even after washing it. One night I woke to find dirt on my bedroom floor, shaped like boot prints leading from the door to the corner of the room. I kept telling myself it was just stress, that maybe I had mixed up the photos, imagined the note, anything that made logical sense. But the dread stayed. It was like the forest had followed me home. I filed a final report and asked to be reassigned to a different region. The supervisor agreed without much questioning, maybe sensing I was done. Months later, out of curiosity, I checked the satellite imagery for those same coordinates. The clearing looked empty, except for a faint rectangular shadow that did not belong to the surrounding trees. Every time I zoomed in, the image flickered, like it was resisting focus. I have not gone back since. Sometimes, though, when I pass a stretch of pine on the highway, I catch that same smell, wet moss, tobacco, and something burning, and I wonder if the cabin is still out there, waiting for another visitor to find it. My name is Tessa Vaughn, and that day belonged to the kind of trip that resets your head after too many months of fluorescent lights and reheated dinners. The plan was a simple loop through hardwood forest in the Upper Peninsula, a modest challenge with a few unmarked spurs for people who like to wander. No guide, no group, just a pack, a paper map with coffee stains, and the promise of a quiet creek for lunch. Life felt crammed with small obligations back then. Answering emails from a borrowed couch, babysitting a neighbor's terrier, saving up for new boots and never buying them. The trailhead sat beside a shuttered bait shop with a hand-painted muskie on wood. Its eye flaked to raw pine. A white sedan with a dented door was the only other car. Windows cracked, stale mint gum wrappers on the dash. The air smelled like wet leaves and rust, like a barn after rain. Steps sank into moss and every stride hummed with that first silence you get when your phone finally gives up the last bar. 2 hours in, a weathered post appeared where the map showed nothing, just a splintered plank with the word cedar burned into it, and an arrow slanted wrong. Curiosity tugged harder than caution ever does when the sun sits high and your legs feel steady. The spur was narrow, hemmed by ferns and young poplar, and the ground underfoot changed from spongy to the rasp of old cinders. Blue bottle caps and a green plastic comb lay half buried in duff, too recent to belong to the era of logging, too forgotten to be anyone's picnic. Birdsong thinned out, wind went quiet, the slope dipped, and my boots knocked against squared stones peeking through roots like teeth. A dark rectangle revealed itself between alders, a low structure where a building should not be, boards grayed to the color of smoke. The creek bed beside it had collapsed into a shallow scar, dry as a knuckle. The mill looked wrong in a way that does not rely on superstition. Roof ribs showed through where tin had peeled back, and a half circle of bolts ran along one wall, the arc where a saw once swung. Pine pitch still bled in glassy beads from a beam near the entrance, as if time had stopped mid-drip. A metal sign lay face down in leaves. Flipping it with my boot revealed the words Cedar Hollow Lumber in faded red, and beneath it, a smaller line that someone had scratched out with a blade. The doorway yawned wide, framed by 2 posts scarred waist-high like belts had rubbed there for years. Inside, dust hung in the light like fine flour, and a swallow burst from the rafters and vanished through a gap with a sound like a card flicking spokes. Every step answered with a dry whisper, nails talking to old wood. Polaroids covered the far wall, 100 small windows pinned with finishing nails, edges curled from damp. Some were sun-bleached to the color of milk. Others still held their blues and greens, faces caught mid-laugh, mid-squint, mid-sweat at a trail junction. People posed with backpacks, with dogs, with walking sticks whittled from saplings. The captions were written in different hands but always in the same place, a stripe of Sharpie across the bottom border. First names, a trail nickname, sometimes a distance or a weather note. A few showed pairs, a few showed trios. Several showed a lone person, centered as if someone else had taken the shot and then stepped back into the trees without a word. One detail snagged me harder than the rest. Every photograph wore a small notch near the top edge, as if trimmed with the same dull blade, the same length lost every time. The pattern felt deliberate, like a habit learned and never questioned. I stood there longer than I meant to, tracing faces with my eyes, half expecting one of them to blink. A gust came through a split in the siding and turned a few Polaroids sideways, making them sway like cards on a string. That sound, the faint ticking of plastic against the wall, echoed louder than it should have. My flashlight beam caught a corner where newer nails glinted silver against old wood. The photos there were crisp, colors still sharp, no sun fade at all. One showed a woman in a red jacket at a trail sign that looked familiar. It took a few seconds to realize I had passed that very sign earlier that day. The angle, the moss on the post, even the broken branch leaning behind it. It was identical. The next photo over showed a car parked by the bait shop. The same dent on the door, the same sun visor half down. My pulse thudded inside my ears, a sound so heavy it filled the space. I stepped back, trying to make sense of it, and my boot knocked something metallic. A Polaroid camera, the kind with a yellow stripe, sat on its side near a pile of splintered lumber. It had a fresh pack inside. The little counter window read 3. I lifted it out of reflex, then set it down just as quickly. Something about touching it felt wrong, like interrupting a process that was still happening. Dust motes spiraled in the light, and the faint click of the camera's shutter arm shifted on its own when the wind changed. My fingers itched to check the film, but I walked to the doorway instead, needing distance from those faces. Outside, the air felt heavier, the light dimmer, though clouds hadn't moved. A strange hush covered the forest, the kind that makes you notice your own breathing. The sedan was gone when I reached the top of the hill. The trail seemed longer on the way back. My map felt useless. Landmarks that had been obvious before, downed birch, broken post, a hollow stump, were either missing or doubled. It was like walking inside a loop that had forgotten where it began. I must have taken a wrong turn because the creek appeared again, dry and familiar, and there the mill stood exactly as before. This time, smoke trickled faintly from one of the roof gaps, thin and gray, dissolving before reaching the trees. A sound came with it, slow tapping, like nails being set, deliberate and patient. I shouted, partly to prove I was still the only living thing out there. No answer came, the tapping stopped. Then something slid down the wall inside, a shuffle of paper, a soft thump. I could not leave it alone. The doorway framed the same beam of light as before, but now only one Polaroid hung on the far wall. Just one. It glowed faintly in the dust. I stepped closer, heart punching a steady rhythm, not sure whether I wanted to see it or not. The picture was still drying. You could smell the chemical tang. It showed the doorway of the mill, empty except for a blurred figure at the edge of the frame, standing just outside the light, half turned as though walking away. The figure's backpack matched mine. My throat went dry. I remember backing out slowly, not running because running might make whatever was happening real. When I turned for the main trail again, the sound of the creek returned, steady and cold, though the bed had been dry before. By the time I reached the bait shop clearing, daylight had thinned into that gray edge where everything looks both near and far. The lot was empty. Tire tracks vanished in shallow puddles that reflected the warped Muskie sign. My car door was locked, same as before, but the back seat smelled faintly of smoke, and something white stuck to the inside of the window. Another Polaroid, taped with yellowing adhesive. It showed the mill from a distance taken through trees as if from the trail itself. The same beam of light spilled through its doorway, but now a figure stood inside, holding a camera pointed toward the trees. I drove without checking the mirror, hands gripping the wheel until the highway swallowed the forest. That night in the motel, sleep would not come. The heater rattled and coughed, and I kept checking the chair where my backpack sat, half expecting to hear the click of a shutter. The Polaroid lay on the table under a cup of coffee I did not drink. I called the local ranger office the next morning. A man answered with the kind of patience used for tourists who think they have seen ghosts. He asked for the name of the trail, then went quiet for a long stretch before telling me the mill at Cedar Hollow had been demolished more than 20 years ago after a fire. No structure standing there now, he said flatly, as if rehearsed. I thanked him, hung up and packed fast. The air outside smelled like rain again, but no clouds lingered above the trees. A few weeks later, an officer contacted me after I sent them the Polaroid. They confirmed it matched the spot where several hikers had disappeared over the last 2 decades. Every one of their cases had been filed after the mill's documented demolition. The photographs they recovered from the scene, those not ruined by moisture, showed the same pattern I had seen. The notched edges, the names, the faces half smiling into the woods. None of the missing people were ever found. The camera, they said, contained undeveloped film, but every frame came out blank, pure white. The officer's tone held a pause before ending the call, as though something still bothered him that he could not put into words. Sometimes I wake up certain I can still smell the chemical sting of fresh Polaroid film, that sharp sweetness that dries at the back of your throat. I deleted the digital copies of the pictures months ago, but one file keeps reappearing in my cloud storage, always with the same name, Cedar Hollow Joe 01. When I open it, the image loads grain by grain until it settles into view. The doorway of the mill again, faint smoke rising, and a single figure standing inside. The outline never matches my posture, but the backpack is still mine. I have changed every password I own, but it keeps coming back like the forest is not finished with me yet.